Hello everyone, this is Tom Uren. I'm here with the Grugq for another Between Two Nodes discussion. G'day Grugq, how are you?
G'day Tom, finding yourself?
I'm well. This week's discussion is brought to you by Sandfly Security. I spoke to Sandfly's CEO and founder, Craig Rowland, this week, and we talked about how Linux is the dark matter of security. It's everywhere, but no one really knows how much it's compromised and what adversaries get up to. So this week, or maybe last week, Grugq, Microsoft launched a new security program specifically tailored at Europe. And it turns out that there's a kind of a backstory here that I wasn't really aware of. So people in Europe are concerned about digital sovereignty. It turns
Did you say
out
Europe or China? Or because
Chinese have been concerned for a long time. And it turns out that Europeans are now getting concerned. And so there's several different pieces of news that are sort of behind this discussion. So one of them is that the Trump administration sanctioned the lead prosecutor for the International Criminal Court. So the prosecutor had announced some sort of action against Israel. The Trump administration sanctioned him. As a result, Microsoft removed his access to Outlook.
So he's lost access to his OnlyFans account, which was linked to his Outlook.
Well, ironically, the prosecutor is under a sexual harassment cloud. So there have been allegations made against him.
But he kept his Outlook account.
Well, now he's using Proton Mail. But the broader point is that from the European point of view, we can't have an organization that we endorse, the ICC, like its IT infrastructure be
operated by a third party that is not part of the EU, because it might act against the EU's interests at some point.
Yeah, the US has never signed on to the criminal court. So news this week, the European Commission is in talks to replace Azure.
So how is Microsoft taking that? Because I'm sure that...
Well, I think Microsoft has acted like tremendously quickly, actually. So I'm looking at a post from Brad Smith, who's Microsoft's vice chair and president. And he's the person who over the years has typically dealt with, I guess I would call them digital sovereignty, human rights, anti-hacking type campaigns. So he's the, I don't want to say conscience of Microsoft, but he's their public face for advancing those kind of issues. Now, in the past, I've thought that some of the things he's said has been quite naive. So this post that I'm looking at is from late April.
Right.
And it talks about new commitments to Europe. It mentions building local European data centers and the cloud ecosystem. It talks about keeping data in Europe. It talks about making commitments to not hand over that data.
None of these are the problem, though. Yeah, keep going. It's just going to say, like, all of the things that he lists, like, that's nice, but none of them are, we will not turn off the accounts of people that, upset Trump, essentially.
So
right,
like,
it's a lot of, like, we will defend your cybersecurity. It's like, yeah, that's great, but will you, like, defend me keeping my account, which is...
Yeah, so one of the
Yeah.
solutions they're offering is basically the ability to run Microsoft Stack in your own data center without Microsoft's input. Now,
that sounds like a much cheaper option, to license and run absolutely everything in-house.
So I'm not convinced how practical that is, but I think it's really interesting to see Microsoft so early and aggressively try and address this problem. So, like, just reading the titles, build a broad AI and cloud ecosystem across Europe, uphold Europe's digital resilience even when there is geopolitical volatility.
Okay, that doesn't mean anything. Like
We will continue to protect the privacy of European data. We will always help and protect and defend Europe's cybersecurity. We will help strengthen Europe's economic competitiveness, including open source. Now, I think that doing this early, relatively early, compared to, say, Google or AWS, is actually a really good move.
Yep.
I don't know how effective it is because I kind of agree with you. The problem is not what Microsoft is doing. The problem is the environment Microsoft sits in.
Right. It's, hypothetically, if there was a telecoms equipment provider, right, who was in a politically problematic country, but they made they made good equipment and good kit. Would you want to deploy that on your national backbone? Or would you say, it's a problem where these people are based and we can't, we just can't use Huawei?
That's exactly what strikes me as well. This is exactly the same as the situation Huawei found itself in, I don't know, maybe a decade ago now, where fundamentally people don't trust them because of the political system. Now, the difference between the US and China is that there is in the US a strong history of independent courts, and you could bet that Microsoft would take cases to the court and represent their customers' interests. But it's the exact same dynamic. How much do you believe in the strength of the rule of law in the US on an ongoing basis? Would you place your entire government in the hands of that for perhaps decades to come?
Right. Or would you go in-house and develop national resilience?
Yeah, I think you'd have to be thinking of a plan B at this point.
Yeah, it would be irresponsible not to, I think. I like that the very first thing that they say is that they're going to help Europe with AI. And it's like, they're going to make sure that you get Copilot no matter what. That's the problem. It's like somehow Europe is complaining that they might lose access to Copilot.
Well, I mean, Microsoft does have that partnership with OpenAI. I'm not sure where that's at anymore. So it could be a range of different models, to be fair. There's also another post, also by Brad Smith, in early June, just 5 days later, about a new European security program. So this doesn't specifically talk about digital sovereignty per se. It's focused on security, but I think it's got the same
themes.
Yeah, same themes. It's pushing along the same line. You can rely on us for security.
It's like digital sovereignty. It's a thing that Russia, China, and now the EU are worried about. But there's very different aspects of it. Russia and China are very concerned about their information ecosystem, the information environments, and so their idea of digital sovereignty is a lot more about controlling the information that people have access to.
Yep.
And I think that Europe is less concerned about that and more concerned about whether they have control over their own infrastructure or if a potentially hostile third party does. And so they're both digital sovereignty, but they're sort of different ends of the spectrum, I guess.
So going back to the first post, it's actually quite frank, I think, which I think is good. So for example, it says business continuity partnerships. After a long section where it says we respect European law, it also says, finally, we will designate and rely upon European partners with contingency arrangements for operational continuity in the unlikely event Microsoft were ever required by a court to suspend services. And so it's saying, we recognize that you're concerned about this. We've got a plan for that, so you don't have to worry about it. And I think from a messaging point of view, it's better to say, yeah, look, we understand why you're concerned, and we want to work through this with you together. So I actually think, I kind of admire that. I think it would be very easy for PR people to say, oh, no, we can't mention the bad thing that everyone is thinking about.
Yeah, I think they can get away with it because this is not going to be covered by Fox News. basically. Do you think Google will do the same? That they'll come out with the same statement and sort of make the same sort of guarantees? If the 4 judges that are involved in this thing, are they going to lose their Gmail accounts, their Google accounts, and sort of like all of their data for that?
Yeah, so when it comes to the International Criminal Court, there were sanctions. They suspended Mr. Khan's email, so he was the chief prosecutor. And then there were further sanctions where another 4 people in the criminal court were sanctioned. And so I'm looking at this New York Times article, and it says that when Khan was sanctioned, they talked to the criminal court and then they switched off his email. The company said it had since enacted policy changes that had been in the works before the episode to protect customers in similar geopolitical situations in the future. When the Trump administration sanctioned 4 additional ICC judges this month, their email accounts were not suspended. And that is dated June 20. So I guess it must have known that these things were coming. It published in late April about, here are concerns that we're addressing.
And they moved to address them fairly quickly. And I think that's smart because it looks like they would be losing a lot of business otherwise. Right, I
think they might lose a lot of business anyway, but I think you've got to do what you can. And to me, it sounds like the sanctions are the incident that precipitates action.
Right.
Like all of a sudden you realize, we've got a problem. We need to figure out a plan of action. And so my theory
I'm sure
is
that this is a thing that they've been thinking about for a long time, but there's never been any need to prioritize it compared to like literally anything else. Like I can't imagine that this is brand new to them. Like they must have considered it, but it's just until it literally happened to a major customer in a major market.
Well, I mean, it hasn't happened to I guess the ICC is a symbolically important customer, maybe not a major customer. In a way, it sort of wraps up the concerns about the rule of law, I suppose, just because of the nature of the sanctioned entity. I think maybe Google and Amazon have not yet had to face that because they haven't had a specific incident that's triggered a process
in
to
quite
work
the same
through
way.
what to do. Yeah. So maybe if the ICC had used Google Workspace, for example.
Right. All right.
Which is kind of hard to imagine, but I mean, lawyers run on Word documents.
No, it's exactly. I was going to say, like, it seems like this is a thing that Apple would have to be concerned about as well, because an iCloud account is sort of like your hardware is linked to it. Like you're just like with a Google account, it's linked to, if you've got an Android phone without a Google account, it's quite difficult to use. Whereas if you have an iPhone without an Apple account, it's impossible to use.
Right. I mean, I suppose if I was Apple, I would say that I don't know who the QZ32 at iCloud.com is.
Well, that's a way that encryption protects them, I think.
Whereas for an organization like the ICC, you can say, oh, yes, we know the ICC, and yes, we know that Mr. Khan has an account with a Microsoft account which gets email. Like you can't say, oh, whose account is this?
New phone, who dis?
Yeah, exactly. Whereas I think for a lot of Apple services, it's not necessarily tied to an organization in the same way.
Right. But I mean, they sanctioned him specifically, right? So surely if he has an iPhone, that would include it.
Well, I mean, I think it would, but how much responsibility, like how much do you think Apple should know who a phone belongs to?
Yeah.
Like how many Mr. Khans are there that have iPhones? There must be thousands.
Certainly. Like I just say, like very briefly, because he has to have a credit card that's registered with them in order to pay for his stuff. They could figure out who he is if they want to.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, like it's.
I think it's interesting that Microsoft found some policy solution to avoid having to do the same thing to more.
If only Huawei had thought of that, then Like we want to assure you that we have policies in place that will, protect you in case of this worst case scenario that you guys have made up. The Chinese government forcing us to do something against your interests. We have internal policies in place. And
so I think in a very real sense, Microsoft's in a better situation because it can demonstrate that you've still got service. Whereas the case against Huawei was always the hypothetical. They could
degrade. They could do something they could do something invisible as well, right? Like they could monitor that you wouldn't know about it, and you can't really verify that they're not monitoring in the same way that you can verify that you still have an email account.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Right. And in Australia, the debate was in a crisis they could do something that would be essentially maybe not irrecoverable, but would be maybe decisive or very significant. So it was a sort of hypothetical threat for some point in the future, and you can never assuage concerns about a hypothetical threat that's very serious sometime in the future. It's impossible. Whereas this is Microsoft can allay concerns about a current threat right now by keeping those 4 email accounts active.
It's not quite the same thing, right? Like if you do lose your email, that's bad. But if an entire country loses its telecommunications backbone, that's a bit worse.
Yeah. So that was Huawei was a tail risk argument, like very significant consequences, like a small chance, but a chance you could, a threat that you could never eliminate.
Yeah. And it's sort of, you can't risk it because no matter how small the chance is, the consequences are just too catastrophic. It's not possible to live with that sort of Damocles over your head.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it was a coercive state threat. Now, I guess, talking about it in these terms, it makes me think that what Microsoft has to do is remove that sort of Damocles, make sure that it doesn't exist. And I guess it's got different layers to that. Right. And at the most extreme is you can run all our stuff on your own hardware. If you're in that situation where you must remove that threat, there you go. Here's our answer. And I suppose their pitch is that you're used to Microsoft stuff. It interoperates with everything. You can have all the benefits and no sword. Right.
They've got layers of stuff as well, right? They can say like, look, we've got European subsidiaries. We're going to have a data center owned by a European subsidiary that is legally responsible for all of European email accounts, Microsoft accounts registered within that jurisdiction. Yep. Therefore, regardless of what happens to Microsoft US, that will not impact the European part.
Yeah.
They can find ways of making that work, I think, which is...
Yeah. So one of those companies, in a previous job, I was talking to them and they said that self-interestedly, they said the way to do it would be to place legal obligations on local staff. Mm-hmm. So you've basically got essentially hostages who, if you ever thought were that the company was doing the wrong thing by you, you had a recourse that would be very powerful for local staff. So I guess that's Microsoft must have tens of thousands of employees in Europe.
Yeah, I'm struggling to see how that's like. I don't think they want their executives to be arrested.
No, but I think that's the point, right? Like,
right,
we don't want to be arrested, and our presence there is in a way a guarantee or a sign of good faith, or
there are hostages, is what you're saying.
Well, yeah, I think that's right. And at the time, this was in the context of a discussion about classified material, and it was several years ago, so it's a very different political context. But it was when you're really concerned about that stuff, you can raise the stakes locally with laws about responsibility and who's responsible, I guess. And so I think that still applies.
Countries have a great track record of holding executives accountable for bad things that their companies do. I mean, that's...
Well, ironically, maybe not ironically, this also plays out in terms of Huawei in that the daughter of the CEO was held in Canada for a long time. I don't know. That didn't really help anyone. I don't think there were any winners in that situation.
Yeah.
It seems like Microsoft has been forced to act, but it's also gone quite aggressively to try and allay these concerns. So at this point, to me, it seems like digital sovereignty is never going to go away. It was a thing that the big tech companies fought against for a long time because I guess it was just expensive.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of against their interests. Right?
Yeah.
They don't want... Yeah, it makes sense. They would rather have everything in one place and it would just be easier for them. And they don't want to be forced into a billion different local laws because that's just going to expensive and confusing and they won't be as competitive against locals and so on and so forth. And it makes sense, but it's still like it's not necessarily what's in their best interest is not necessarily in a state's best interest. Right.
I think that's fair enough.
Hot take.
I mean,
yeah.
I think this is a recognition of that. Like, I think in the past, they would have tried to marshal all these arguments about why digital sovereignty doesn't make sense.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily result in better security. Now they're at the point, it's like, we recognize that digital sovereignty is a thing. Here's all the ways that we will bend over backwards to help you, to reassure you.
Have access to Copilot.
That does feel like one thing where marketing has resulted in that getting pushed up the list. I think that actually there is a legitimate concern there in terms of if you're going to use AI tools, often they're cloud-based, and one of the concerns is data leakage into the cloud. So that actually seems fair enough, I suppose.
Absolutely.
But I don't know that it's your top concern. Like, I don't know that I would put it number one. I think Microsoft switching off your accounts because of sanctions is probably a higher up concern, maybe.
Well, I mean, not for me. But no. As a state, I think the things that you're worried about are critical parts of your infrastructure, such as your IT services being controlled by an outside entity that you don't have any leverage over.
Yep.
Right. Like that's just an implicit, and and while you're in a state of agreement with this external entity and where they're located and everything's going fine, you can avoid thinking about it because it's just not an issue at that point. But when it does become an issue, this is the sort of thing that would have been a lot cheaper to solve if Europe had their own tech infrastructure, if they had their own IT giants.
Yep, it's a bit late now.
Yeah, the best way to establish digital sovereignty is 20 years ago.
Yep. Thanks a lot, Grugq.
Thanks a lot, Tom.